Hey there, everybody. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another one of our Rant Series editions. Today, we're going to talk about the concept album. Pretty cool thing, right? Most people love to buy an album by a band they love, where the band goes in and really figures out this whole intricate conceptual storyline. A lot of great ones released over the years. Especially, we're talking here about metal, heavy metal, progressive rock mostly, some classic rock stuff as well we're going to fit in here. So there's a ton of them. I own, I don't want to say hundreds, but I own a ton of albums, of concept albums, I should say, from a load of bands across multiple genres. Too many of them to talk about in one show. So what I did was I kind of went through my collection here, there, and everywhere, and weeded out some of the ones that I really like a lot, that I think are some of the more important ones. You're going to see some bands are going to be represented a couple times here, but for the most part, I tried to give a pretty good cross selection of really strong concept albums, like I said, across like metal and prog. And I opted not to even bother talking about some of the stinkers. So no, I'm not. I'm going to mention them here, but I'm not going to talk about Music from the Elder by Kiss. I'm not going to talk about The Astonishing by Dream Theater. And I'm not going to talk about Pink Floyd's The Final Cut. Sorry, don't really like those, so I'm not even going to bother. There's going to be no real order here. I've got a couple stacks here. I'm just going to kind of go through. I'm not going to get into too much of the storyline. I may mention some things here and there. You guys can go do that research on your own if you haven't heard any of these, but just let it be known that I recommend these highly. Also, wanted to mention this. I also did not choose what some of you may think are obvious choices based on an album having like a long conceptual piece, but there are other tracks on the album that have nothing to do with that. So 2112 by Rush and Hemispheres, okay, those types of albums I'm not going to talk about today, because they're not concept albums per se. They may have a lengthy epic track that's a concept piece, but as a whole, the albums are not a full concept album. So if you're looking for some of those, you're not going to get them here. So let's just, I'm just going to kind of start randomly choosing things here. So the first one, this is by a British band who actually spent a lot of time in Germany, but they put together this album. I believe this kind of came on the heels, if I remember correctly, as far as the year of release date. This kind of came on the heels of another album by another band that I'm going to talk about, where these guys decided to do an entire album. So remember, it's vinyl back then, two sides of an album, based on a very, very particular storyline. And basically, it's comprised of two long tracks on side one, two long tracks. Actually, no, I'm sorry. Two long tracks. I'm looking, there's live stuff on this one, on this re-release. Basically, side long epic on the first, side long epic on the second side. All basically one long piece. I'm talking about Nectar's Remember the Future. Also happens to be Nectar's biggest selling album here in the US. They condensed parts of this epic piece into a single for FM or AM radio at the time. But a really, really fantastic progressive rock with elements of hard rock album. Little bits of psych from this very, very underrated band. This is, if you like Thick as a Brick, check this out. Kind of, it doesn't sound like it, but the way it's all laid out, a little similar. Again, not really. I'm hating to use that as a comparison, but that's kind of, well, whatever. Anyway, let's move on. The next one, something much more recent. This one came out, about 15 years ago? Not quite 15 years ago. This is The Glorious Burden by Iced Earth, U.S. metal act extraordinaire. Basically, this is John Schaefer's telling of the Civil War. Also a notable album for the first album that Tim River Owens performed with the band. Actually saw them on this tour. Pretty cool album. For some, maybe not one of their stronger ones. I tend to, when I think of Iced Earth, they've done a couple of concept albums. Maybe their concept albums aren't as strong as some of their regular albums, but I kind of like this one much more so than the couple that came after it. But this is pretty good. Horror Show is also very good. That's kind of a concept album. Check that one out too. Good stuff. Okay. have to include both of these because it was a 2-album concept storyline here from German speed metal, power metal, whatever you want to call them. Halloween, Keeper of the Seven Keys, Part 1 and 2. These were a staple of my listening pleasure back in the late 80s. Loved these albums to death. Michael Kiskey's first albums with the band and his best. But really, really great stuff. I think these albums are highly influential to the whole power metal genre. Just great vocals, really amazing arrangements, and just a really, really fun storyline going through both of those there. All right, back to the mid-70s. So this guy was a singer in a band called the Alice Cooper Group. When he, as the group had toured and released a bunch of albums, obviously he became the focal point of the band, and it went from being a group to him being the leader, singer, and ultimately he became Alice, right? So he decided to dump the Alice Cooper Group and go solo. His first album was the concept album about Stephen, kind of a horror story, Welcome to My Nightmare. All right, a lot of great tunes on this one. Very, very notable album. Alan Parsons Project released a bunch of concept albums. I actually probably almost grabbed a couple of them here, but I wanted to kind of, obviously you can't show everything, can't talk about everything. iRobot is probably my favorite of theirs. Again, they had a bunch of them, though. They're all pretty strong. All those ones they released in the early 70s. Very, very good. Early, mid-70s. Very, very good album. Mix of prog and pop and just really good stuff. Okay, so this next band obviously has a few of them. I got to mention all three that I really like a lot. Actually, one I don't like nearly as much as the other two, but I have to mention the third one. Just got to do it. Could not do a concept album show without The Wall, right? So I'm talking about Pink Floyd. Dark Side of the Moon was the first one. Kind of a loose concept album, but it definitely is a concept album. This, of course, is probably their biggest album of all time. My favorite of the three is Animals. Just a fantastic album. Kind of a creepy album. A bizarre album, but I love it to death. And then the last that I'm going to talk about today is The Wall. I like this the least out of the three. I'm not a huge, huge fan of The Wall, but from a conceptual, lyrical storyline stance, I do dig it. I don't find, it's just kind of overblown to me. And I don't, other than a handful of classic tunes on here, I find a lot of this throwaway, whereas these two are pretty much perfect from start to finish, top to bottom. But again, it's a landmark album, so got to include it here. Whether or not I love it or not doesn't really matter. All right, I mentioned it before. Jethro Tull's Thick as a Brick. The story of Gerald Bostock. One long tune across two sides of vinyl. Of course, on CD here. Incredible stuff. This was probably Tull's first foray into full-blown progressive rock, although on Aqualung, another semi-conceptual album, had bits of prog on it as well. This was their real jump into that. And if you like this one, you haven't heard Passion Play, which basically a continuation of this almost. Different concept, different story, but back to the same one long song across two sides of vinyl. Excellent, excellent stuff. All right, probably one of the best metal concept albums of all time, and probably arguably the best album of this band's career, is Queensryche's Operation Mindcrime. Classic top to bottom, stellar songs, really memorable songs, interesting story, and just a landmark album that basically took the progressive metal world by storm when it came out. A favorite of many, including myself. Just some, again, it's the way it's all laid out, the way it goes from track to track to track seamlessly, and with just some standout songs on it as well. A really, really great achievement for them. All right, two from a band out of England, a classic band who arguably started the whole concept album / rock opera thing. Of course, you know I'm talking about The Who. Tommy basically started it off. That pinball wizard, that deaf, dumb, and blind boy. Just an awesome, awesome album. They would go on tour and play the whole thing, or most of the whole thing anyway, start to finish numerous times throughout their career. Roger Daltrey, their singer, is actually touring, doing a Tommy tour right now with an orchestra. A just great, great album. They made a movie out of it, okay, out of the storyline. Fantastic stuff. They would follow that up a couple years later with a story about the mods. Of course, Quadrophenia. Arguably even better. I think that there's great parts of Tommy, but I think if you're looking at an overall work, Quadrophenia, in my opinion, is better. And again, they also made a movie out of the storyline that went to this album. So two, Pete Townsend, what a genius that he wrote both of these things. Landmark concept albums, both of them. All right, what else we got? How about Streets by Savatage, a heavy metal rock opera? Okay, this was pretty damn ambitious for Savatage at the time. They had come out with the Hall of the Mountain King 2 albums prior. The thunderous heavy metal album. A couple albums later, they come out with this thing. Pretty cool, pretty different. You could tell the seeds, perhaps, of Trans-Siberian Orchestra kind of started around this period in time. Bands started doing some orchestral and progressive rock type stuff within their metal framework. Really, really strong album. Speaking of TSO, how about Christmas Eve and Other Stories? That's a concept album. More of holiday-related, holiday theme, but definitely worth mention on this show. A great album. Okay, something more recent. Great band who actually just also released a brand new concept album, but let's talk about one that's been out for a few years. Camelot's Silverthorne. Really good stuff. This is their first album with their now, well, he's not new anymore, but at the time, new lead singer, Tommy Karavec, replacing Roy Khan. Just great, bombastic, symphonic, heavy metal. Call them power metal, call them progressive metal. They kind of sit somewhere in between, but totally symphonic and bombastic, melodic. Really great band. This is a really, really good concept album. From Israel, Orphan Land, Mabul. Got to talk about this one here, right? There is no band like these guys. They call themselves Oriental Metal, whatever that means. Choirs and thunderous guitars and some death metal vocals, clean vocals, female vocals, all sorts of different kind of instruments, a lot of ethnic arrangements and thunderous progressive metal. Really, really fascinating album and band. From Sweden, Evergrey, In Search of Truth. Pretty dark stuff. Not a very happy album, but a really, really great one. God, first on the Master Plan. What a great tune that is. Awesome album. Epica, Divine Conspiracy. These guys have done a couple concept albums since. This one's from about 10 years ago, 11 years ago, actually. Really, really good stuff. Symphonic, death and power metal. Quite good. All right, Fate's Warning, A Pleasant Shade of Gray. Another whole conceptual piece. Basically one long tune, 45 minutes long. Fate's Warning's first, they did some mini epics, that kind of, side-long things earlier in their career, but this was their first step into a full-blown concept piece, concept album. Quite good. Pretty proggy, too. Give them a lot of credit for that. What else? Could have picked I was going to pick Subterranea from this band. I'm talking about IQ, one of the leaders of the second wave of progressive rock in the 80s. But I opted to go for The Road of Bones, which was released not that long ago. I don't know, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago. It's all about a serial killer. Really cool. Again, pretty dark album, but just an amazing progressive rock album. Subterranea is really great too. So I urge you, if you've never listened to IQ, you want to hear some really cool symphonic prog. Okay? But very English, very British sound. They came out at the same time as Marillion did. So if you like the old Marillion stuff with Fish, give IQ a try. This one's really good. Also check out Subterranea. Quite happening. All right, no concept album show would be complete without Seventh Son of a Seventh Son by Iron Maiden. Love this album. For some people, this was the last really good Iron Maiden album. I don't agree with that. But a great way to kind of end the 80s, right? And a great follow-up to Somewhere in Time. Awesome concept piece. Maiden still at their best. I still think Maiden is great. They still release great new material, but your opinion may vary. What else we got here? British progressive rock band. Almost hit it really big in the 70s. They've been around a long, long time. A lot of great albums. A lot of people still love this album. It's called The Snow Goose by Camel. A really gorgeous, gorgeous album. If you like the more lush, melodic forms of progressive rock, especially European and British, for argument's sake, from the 70s, the Snow Goose is a great choice for you. Beautiful stuff. Okay, back to more recent times. I'm all over the place here. I love this album. This is probably one of the best progressive extreme metal albums released over the last decade or so. Right up there with some of the stuff that, Opeth have never really put out a full concept piece, but I think this kind of rivals some of Opeth's really, really great albums from the last decade, especially when they still had death metal influences. But this is kind of takes that, throws in some Dream Theater and some other things, puts out something totally new. I'm talking about Between the Buried and Me, Colors. Love this album. Musically, it's incredible. Jaw-dropping musicality and heavy riffs and complex playing, dizzying solos. You got the fluctuating death metal growls and the soaring clean vocals, keyboards, and it's just so catchy. Just so catchy. And if I had a chance to see this live, and probably some of you hopefully have checked out the DVD or listened to the live album, but just a really, really great story and collection of passages and tunes, and just really, really great stuff, and a massively heavy album. Okay, here's a really, really good one. And this actually happened to be as great as this was. They came out with this album, this band, and then their lead singer and keyboard player, their leader, their songwriter, decided to leave the band. He became a born-again Christian. And, of course, you know I'm talking about Spock's Beard, right? Snow, fantastic album. This is kind of like the successor to The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway many, many years later, obviously. So Neal Morris would leave the band after this album and start up a solo career where he would go on to release one concept album after another, right? We'll get to that in a little bit. But this is a really, really great Spock's Beard album, the last with Neal Morris, and a 2-disc set. Just, fantastic, fantastic stuff. Electric Light Orchestra, Eldorado. Kind of an early album for them, but a pretty cool concept piece. If you're a classic rock fan with little bits of prog and orchestral stuff in there, dig that a lot. Had to include this next band. They got so many choices. I could have pulled out any number of them. But again, to save us a little bit of time here, I picked the one that was the first that I got into, because they're all great. I could have talked about any one of them. Talking about Ayreon, Into the Electric Castle. Fantastic. I mean, every album they release is like a sci-fi rock opera / conceptual piece, right? So could have chosen any one of them. They all feature a myriad of guest vocalists and instrumentalists, and most of them are just fantastic. Again, pick any one you want today. Into the Electric Castle, Ayreon. Blue Oyster Cult, Imaginos, an album that gets like zero credit when people talk about Blue Oyster Cult. It's their lone concept piece. It's very, very cool. It's heavy. It's a latter period release from them. I believe this came out in the late 80s, 88, if I'm not mistaken. Heavy, great, interesting story. Get it. Here's one. Kind of obvious. I almost forgot about this. This is actually a concept album. Very, very cool one, too. David Bowie, Ziggy Stardust. Spiders of Mars. The Tale of Ziggy. Brilliant, right? Brilliant stuff. All right, so I'm cheating a little bit here. I had to pick 3 from this band because each one of these albums is so fantastic. I just had to do it. I'm talking about Marillion, Misplaced Childhood, Clutching at Straws, and Brave. Brave is with Hogarth, Steve Hogarth. These 2 are with Fish. I obviously love these much more than this, but this is damn good too. But these are just mandatory 80s progressive rock, from the second wave. Okay, so this band's, my first instinct was to grab 2112, and I was like, well, no, wait a second. That's not a whole concept album. It's a one long concept piece within a regular album, right? The 2112 title track. The rest of it has nothing to do with that. So I couldn't choose that. And none of their albums, a few of them have like conceptual tracks or epic tunes and all that kind of stuff, but they're really, again, according to Neil Peart, their really only true concept album is Clockwork Angels. which ironically is the last one they put out before they retired. A great album. What a great album to go out on. Really, really strong album from Rush. Moody Blues, Days of Future Past. One of the earlier concept albums. And I didn't grab Sgt. Pepper's kind of a concept album too. Probably should have grabbed that. It's right up over there. Probably, I don't know which actually came out first. So you got Tommy's right up there. I think that's probably the first really visualized concept album or rock opera, whatever you want to call it. This is more, Days of Future Past is more of, there's an idea behind a lot of the songs that kind of flow from one to the next. It's not so much telling a story. Same thing with Sgt. Pepper. But still, if you're looking for those first instances of concept albums, I guess the Moody's and the Beatles probably is kind of where that all started. Maybe. Who knows? Okay. Van den Plas. Cristo. These guys are getting known for their concept albums, one after another after another. They've released a couple in the last couple of years that are fantastic. This one is the one I think that really kind of started it all. A really, really great, great album. And a just really great progressive metal band. Van den Plas. Dig that a lot. It's got the Count of Monte Cristo. How about Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy, Elton John? Basically a concept album about the early days of both Bernie Taupin and Elton John, sort of, right? But kind of fantasy tinged a little bit. A great album. Really, really good album. Okay, Neal Morris, I mentioned him before. So he's put out a string of concept albums, most of them dealing with his new Christian outlook on life. So they're very, very religious in nature. But he actually put together the Neal Morris Band a couple years ago, and they released this album, The Similitude of a Dream. Of course, Mike Portnoy is on board, a couple other guys. This is moving, still a little spiritual, but moving a little bit away from the kind of seemingly a little bit preachy stuff. Wow, this is a powerhouse of progressive rock and progressive metal. Really, really great. And again, anything Neal Morris touches, whether he's writing or singing or just being a part of the band, the music is just so memorable and catchy, filled with hooks and amazing musicianship. Mastodon, Crack the Sky. They also have a couple of concept albums. I think I dig this one the best. Blood Mountain. I almost chose Blood Mountain. I love them both, but I think Crack the Sky I like a little bit more. Again, their albums kind of deal with the different elements and things like that. They also released an album recently, which is a concept album about the kind of the band dealing with a lot of bouts of cancer within each of their families. So it's kind of a concept album about kind of all that. But I prefer these earlier albums, so that's why I chose them. Okay, had to pick two from Symphony X, right? So the first one they did was V. Fantastic. I mean, when this came out, I was like, man, that is one hell of a concept, progressive metal concept album. Who's going to be able to top that, right? And then bunch of years later, they come up with the Iconoclast, which I like even better. This is killer. Killer, killer, killer. Michael Romeo, Russell Allen and Company. Man, is that a great album. More progressive metal. Remedy Lane from Pain of Salvation from Sweden. Fine, fine stuff. Super melodic. Thought-provoking lyrics. Yeah. All right. Styx. Paradise Theater. No, I'm not talking about Kilroy today. Sorry. I like this one, actually. This is a very good album about an old kind of theater, opera house type of thing that's crumbling, going out of business, blah, blah, blah. Still, it's a good album. A lot of good tunes on here. What else? Porcupine Tree, Fear of a Blank Planet. Really good concept piece from Stephen Wilson and Company. Man, do you miss Porcupine Tree? As much as I could have pulled out some Stephen Wilson too. I didn't even think about that. I miss Porcupine Tree. As much as I love the Stephen Wilson solo stuff, I miss Porcupine Tree. Hopefully they'll come back at some point. We'll see. One of my favorites from everything we're talking about here today. It's actually my favorite album of all time by this band. And I remember when this album came out. The band were kind of a little bit of a low. The album that came out before it didn't really do that well. It was kind of poppy, a little bit commercial. And then they came out with this ridiculously good concept album that just kind of changed everything. Of course, I'm talking about Scenes from a Memory Metropolis Part 2 from Dream Theater. Ah, man, is this good. Still to this day, I listen to this, I get chills. I remember going to see that show in New York City live, and I was like, holy crap. Unbelievable stuff. Abigail by King Diamond. I almost chose them. They're both great. I kind of like this one a little bit better. Your mileage may vary. You may like the other one better. King and Company released a couple solo albums. Couple of concept albums. They're all good. I liked Abigail. All right. Tales from Topographic Oceans by Yes. Got to have this one here. This is probably the most confusing of all the concept albums we're going to talk about today. Anybody have any clue what this album is about? We all love it, I know, but it's like this shit is so dense and so out there. I mean, I don't know what Steve Howe and John Anderson were thinking. I dig this album. I don't listen to it that often, though. I really, really need to be in the mood to listen to Topographic Oceans. As great as parts of it is, it's just so overblown and so kind of dense and intricate, and just at time, lyrically, it almost makes no sense at all. But a lot of people love it. I don't dislike it by any means. I do like it. I really have to be in the mood to listen to that. Joe's Garage, Frank Zappa. This is awesome stuff. I haven't actually listened to this in quite a while, but this is a great album. I used to listen to this a ton back in the day. Funny stuff, great guitar work, great musicianship. All right, what else we got here? Three Friends by Gentle Giant. Kind of a loose concept album, and one of the only ones that they ever really did. But a really, really cool story about young friendship, and as people and how that friendship kind of changes and morphs as people grow older. A great, one of my favorite Gentle Giant albums. A really, really lovely, warm album. Just a great prog album from a band that's so unique. And the last one I'm going to talk about today, because of course you're probably saying, when the fuck is he going to talk about The Lamb? When is he going to get down to it? Stop with all this other nonsense. So here it is, guys. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway by Genesis. The Story of Rael. A really cool album. A fun album. Again, another one of those weird albums that's just kind of like all over the place, and some of it kind of makes sense, doesn't make sense, but it's Gabriel Era Genesis, the last album he would play with the band, sadly. There's all sorts of stories out there about the tour they did with it, with all the costumes and all the film playing behind. It was kind of a disaster, but I think the whole concept is kind of neat, as weird as it is, and there's some great songs on here. Really, really great songs on here. Hackett and Banks and Rutherford, Collins, Gabriel, just really, really cool stuff. And especially when it comes to like progressive rock, kind of the blueprint for everything that came after it, right? So a lot of great stuff we talked about here. Obviously, I'm sure I forgot a bunch. There's a couple by the Kinks I missed. How about the Pretty Things? Like I said, I mentioned some other bands that have concept pieces that I decided not to talk about. And there's a lot of more obscure prog stuff that I didn't even bother to get into. But you know what they are. If there's stuff that I kind of forgot that you would like to, kind of mention in the comments. Just list them out. I'm sorry I forgot them, or I chose not to cover them today. Again, you can't do everything. We're clocking in at just under a half hour here, so that's good enough. I think a lot of cool stuff we covered. A lot of great concept albums. Do you love them? Do you hate them? What's your opinion about concept albums? Personally, I dig them. They're not all great. Some of them work better than others, but it's kind of cool to hear that, hear like a full, complete storyline within the confines of an album, whether it be metal or prog or what have you. So I dig concept albums as long as they're done correctly. They're done, well, not done correctly, as long as they're done where you can enjoy it, you can follow on the storyline, and the music's, interesting. I forgot the Flower Kings. Flower Kings have a bunch of concept albums too. See, can't get them all in here. Anyway, this is on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. Of course, we're here on the mighty YouTube. We got a lot of great stuff coming up. I believe the next thing we're going to be doing, look for it over the next, hopefully, few days, if not within the next week, is I'm going to do a show. We did the best debuts of all time. Well, how about those bands that didn't fall into the sophomore slump, who released their second albums were either as strong, if not stronger, than the debut, right? A lot of those. Some really good ones. So that's probably going to be next. We've got all sorts of other things coming up. So till then, again, www.seatranquility.org. Go indulge in some concept albums, folks. Get into it. We'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.